What do we call muscle power? Well, actually muscle power is mechanical power, which is the rate at which mechanical work is produced, and then it requires movement, right? And the faster you do that movement, the higher the muscle power you produce. During a functional task, like the sit-to-stand test, we need to use our muscles to produce force, and that force will produce joint rotation and movement, and we need to lift up our body mass, right? So this leads to a movement that if it is faster, it implies that you produce a greater physical performance and greater muscle power. How does aging affect muscle power? Though it has already been seen in the last presentations, and also how does aging affect relative muscle power? Because as I said, we need to move our body mass in most of the activities of daily living, so the overload that we have to move is also very important. And relative muscle power is the ratio between muscle power and body mass. But first, we need to understand the different components of relative muscle power. So on the top of that pyramid, we have relative muscle power that depends on allometric muscle power, and this is quite important, in my opinion, that we normalize muscle power and also muscle size to body size, because different individuals can have different levels of muscle power, but also muscle size, not because of the reason that a different body size. So from the ratio between allometric muscle power and body mass index, we obtain relative muscle power, and at the same time we can look into the main components that affect allometric muscle power, which are a specific muscle power, or muscle power produced per unit of muscle tissue, and also muscle tissue itself, but normalized to height squared or body size. So from these three main components, it's from how we obtain at the end relative muscle power. How does aging affect relative muscle power? Well, in this study conducted in Copenhagen, we assessed more than 1,000 participants from all ages using the Nottingham Power Rig, which is this device that assesses muscle power during an unilateral leg extension action, very explosive action. And what we observed using a piecewise regression analysis, instead of applying a linear equation to the whole data, was that before the age of 40 years, in both men and women, there is no change in relative muscle power or allometric muscle power or a specific muscle power. And after that age is where we can observe a progressive decline in all muscle power measures. In terms of body mass index, it occurs the opposite. We observe a progressive increase in body mass index before the age of 75 years in women and 65 years in men, and after that we observe a progressive decline. No changes in leg skeletal muscle index. Of course, this was measured with DICSA, and we know that it presents some limitations. But it wasn't until they were 75 years in the case of women and 65 years in the case of men that they experienced a decline in leg skeletal muscle index, right? In a recent published study, what we did was that we measured the torque-velocity relationship using an isokinetic device during knee extensions. In that way, we applied an equation that provided the whole torque-velocity relationship and also the whole power-velocity relationship. Actually, we applied a novel equation here that combines a linear region and an hyperbolic hill-type region, because we have observed very frequently that there is a linear region for the torque velocity relationship. And basically, you can look the right of this slide, and you can see that from young people on the top to middle-aged people and older people, there is a decline in maximum muscle power in the apex of that power-velocity relationship, right? But this decline is more pronounced in older people when compared to middle-aged or young people. And if we look at the left of this slide, we can see the mechanisms that lead to that decline in muscle power, if it is related to torque reduction or if it's related to velocity, and it is both. But actually, we can see a great variation among individuals. So for some individuals, this was a 10 years follow-up study. Some individuals experience a decline, but others experience no change or even an increase in the different parameters of the torque velocity relationship. So individualization is key, actually, because we always look at average data, but there are some individuals that did not experience a decline. And I like this torque velocity or force velocity relationship a lot. Why? Because it can tell us the different mechanisms that are leading to those declines. For example, if we look at that part of the torque velocity relationship, the declines might be more related to central activation, to the total amount of motor units, or maybe also to the size of the muscles. While if we look at the other part of the torque velocity relationship, the mechanisms leading to a decline might be more related to how fast the motor unit convey action potentials, how these are transmitted to the single muscle fibers, how fast are the single muscle fibers, and also how the single muscle fibers transmit to bones through tendons, right? But it has also a functional relevance, because in this study we observed that when assessing the force-velocity relationship in older people, there were some of them that had lower muscle power because they had a deficit in force or a deficit in force at low velocities, while others presented a deficit in force at high velocities. So the profiles were quite different in those cases, and at the end, either if it was caused by a deficit in force or velocity, they had a low muscle power level, and that was associated with health-related quality of life, frailty, cognitive function, physical performance, okay? But actually, if we look at the profiles, maybe the intervention should be different for each profile. How does exercise can counteract this age-related decline in muscle power? In this case, we conducted an exercise study in COPD patients, which is a pulmonary disease, but that also affects very severely muscles, right? In a hospital in Toledo. The exercise program was based in a part that consisted of 2 exercises, like leg press and chest press. Both of them was performed in a power-oriented way, so each repetition was performed as fast as possible. Only 3 sets of 8 repetitions with the optimal load, that we will see what it is. But also there was a second part with a high-intensity interval training performed on a cyclometer. Twice a week for 12 weeks. Okay, the optimal load is the load that maximizes muscle power. So after an individual assessment of the force-velocity relationship, we selected the load that maximized power production, and that was the load that was used during the training program. What we observe, and we can focus first on maximum muscle power adaptations, is that there was an increase around 40% in maximum power in the intervention group when compared to the control group. In addition, there was an increase in maximum isometric force, rate of force development, especially at the shorter time points, right? So in the more explosive action. So the effect was less positive as contraction time increased. So especially beneficial for short and rapid contractions. Also, we look at physical performance. We observe an increase in the intervention group in habitual gait speed and also in 5 sit-to-stand time. So an increase in physical performance in the intervention group. And lately, we have looked into the effects after 10 months of training cessation, which are actually right now under review. And what we have found is that even after 10 months, after finishing the training program, some gains are retained, okay? So although the increases in maximum muscle power were of 40%, these COPD patients still have an increased maximum muscle power, around 20%, when compared to the baseline levels. And it was not the case for example, rate of force development at longer contraction times, that there is a decline compared to the baseline level, but in the shorter time, at 100 milliseconds, there is still a gain in function. And regarding physical performance, we have also observed residual and beneficial effect of the intervention, even 10 months after finishing the training program. Okay? In a different kind of patients, in this case, is from a frailty unit, which is a unit that we created to receive people that had suffered a fall, and then they are diagnosed as pre-frail or frail. We observe also that with a similar exercise program, instead of using a cycle ergometer, we use a treadmill and walking. We found a substantial increase in maximum power, also in physical performance, especially these participants had a very low physical performance level, so the gains in that aspect were great. And finally, also, we observed a decrease in the number of frailty criteria that they had. And finally, about the specificity of force, velocity, power adaptations, because we saw that there are different force velocity profiles that might be treated differently. In this case, 45 community dealing older people, and I say also 90 legs, because this was an unilateral resistance training design. So some of them train one leg light load versus non-exercise. Others train heavy load with one leg and the other leg no exercise. And finally, others train light load with one leg and heavy load with the other leg. This is the kind of exercise that they did. It's unilateral leg press. This is the heavy load condition. In every contraction, we ask the participants to contract as fast and as strong as possible, explosively. So in this case, with the heavy load, they did 6 sets of 6 repetitions. While in the light load condition, they did 12 repetitions. You can see that in this case, there is a air phase, right? Because the load is so low that they jump. They got to jump. And also, it is performed as fast and strong as possible. What were the adaptations? In this case, the specificity of each power-oriented resistance program was fulfilled, and we observed higher changes in the forces at high velocities for the light load power training group, while we observed higher gains in force at low velocities in the heavy load power training group, right? Also, in terms of isometric performance, we found a significant increase only in the light, or especially in the light load condition, again for the very explosive and shorter contractions. For those muscle size lovers, we have here some adaptations in muscle size. So we observe changes, positive changes in both groups, but more especially in the heavy load resistant training group in rectus femoris cross-sectional area and vastus lateralis cross-sectional area. And finally, since we couldn't measure the differences in functional adaptation in, for example, walking, because they were training differently with each leg, we adopted a functional perspective of using the leg press, and we calculated the velocity at which they contracted against a load relative to their body weight in a way of approximate that functional aspect of the adaptations. And in this case, both the heavy load and the light load resistant training program were equivalent in obtaining adaptations in velocity with that load, but also in power. And how can we easily monitor muscle power in older people? In this case, a little of propaganda as well. This is a free app that you can download for iOS or Android to assess muscle power. It's very easy to use, and you only need a chair and this tool, right? And we also develop operational algorithm and cutoff points obtained from more than 10,000 Europeans, right? To detect low relative muscle power in older people, but also playing with this algorithm, you can see what is the component that is causing that low relative muscle power, and at the end, you can get what should be the goal, or the goal that you should go for in each case, right? So as a final take-home messages, depending on your level of relative muscle power, and depending on your lifestyle, you can follow a trajectory across your adult lifespan. A negative event can provoke that there is a premature decrease in relative muscle power. Fortunately, exercise can revert this premature decline in relative muscle power and postpone the onset of frailty and disability. But also, of course, a lifelong exercise perspective can prevent even more that decline in muscle power. And although it's inevitable that muscle power is going to decline, we can postpone disability and frailty until the end of our lives. So thank you for your attention, and thank you also to a lot of people that participated in all this investigation, and thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Any questions? Yes.
In your COPD study, you talked about a residual effect. Do you think it's possible that being involved in your trial itself gave those patients more confidence to exercise so that they were more active between the start and when you retested?
Yeah, I hope so. Actually, we measured physical activity levels before the training program, after the training program, but not during that period of no training. But my guess is that, if you have a better condition, you have more confidence for going out, for example, and participating in other activities. So apart from the maybe or possible residual effect per se, probably there is an increase, or I hope so, that exercise can also increase exercise or physical activity participation even after you finish the training program. And this is, I think that this is a quite efficient perspective and strategy, because public systems could provide short exercise programs for some weeks every year and try to reach as many people as possible. So yeah.
Great talk. A quick question about, okay, we all want to maintain our power when we get older. And I certainly do some, rather more high-risk type of exercise. But the question is, what is the injuries with the more high-powered exercises, the jumping that you showed? Are you documenting, injuries in those older participants, or there's no issues at all?
No issues at all, actually. But actually, I have to say that we spend the required time to familiarize the participant with the adequate technique and with the exercise. So you can apply a power-oriented resistance program in someone that enter into your gym or your laboratory the first day. Probably some of them might need several sessions to familiarize with the exercise.
I had a question. Considering your increase in muscle power that were substantial after training, what do you attribute this increase in power to? I think you showed an increase in cross-sectional area. What about recruitment? Because I think it plays a lot in these games.
Yeah, we didn't measure something in that sense, but we did measure rate of force development. So during power actions, you have a little amount of time to produce force, and in that sense, the results from the rate of force development testing tell us that maybe a better recruitment of fast single muscle fibers, and also maybe if there were some individuals that had any kind of limitation regarding central activation on how fast they are able to recruit muscles, perhaps that was improved, because it's true that in the literature there is some debate in that sense, but probably some of the participants had limitations in that sense. So I guess that they were motivated mostly by changes in the neural system instead of muscle size or that.
Yes, I think so, because when you were training at 40% of muscle power, or 40% of the maximum load, I can't remember which.
Yeah.
There was a very large increase in maximum shortening velocity in vivo.
Yeah.
And presumably that is due to recruitment, certainly not fiber shifts in these old people.
ATPase activity as well, probably resistance training is known to produce a faster enzyme activity. So, yeah.
Carlo, do you have any views on that? Okay. Right. Thank you very much,
you.
Jose.